The Birchbark House by Louise Erdrich.
Nemo means fourth, and that was what they called the baby. But soon, Grandma said, the baby would have to have a name. The tiny boy was a spirit, so far, who had come to live here and was deciding whether or not to stay. Grandma told Omakayas to be careful with him, little baby Nemo, because he might decide to go back to the other place if he thought his big sister was mean. So Omakayas was very gentle with the baby. She rocked him in the branch-held ticking-noggin with great consideration. She gathered spongy moss and old oak punk to stuff into the cradle board and use as a diaper. She twirled and dangled the little web of sinew and the tobacco ties and bitten birch bark pretties that Grandma tied onto the head guard of the ticking noggin. She fed Nemo tiny bits of the best food when Mama wasn't looking. She felt, in her heart, streams of love for the baby pouring through, and she begged her mother to let her take Nemo out and cart him to the lake on her hip. But her mother smiled and touched Omakayas's hair gently and shook her head. Gaween. No, she was too young. Grandma gave her the willow doll instead, and told her to let the baby sleep, directed her to play with little Pinch. But she knew what that would mean. Pinch would jump on her back and yell, "Nadai! Get moving!" He would pull her braids. He would use her as practice, bow and arrow target. He would tip over the rock children and the rock people she made of specially piled lake pebbles. He would destroy her rock people village down by the beach. No, she didn't want to play with him. Little Pinch, never. Half the summer went by quickly after the visit from the bear. Omakayas stayed thoughtful. She helped hoe the corn patch almost every day and never complained. She was kind, hard-working, patient, but she was also lost in her own thoughts. She startled when spoken to, went to sleep early and slept long, dreamed hard but couldn't remember the night's adventures. And she also had those dizzy moments that her grandma said meant she was special to the spirits. One day her mother said to her grandmother, if she wasn't so young, I'd give her the charcoal. Grandma's deep and far-seeing eyes took in Omakayas. She seemed to see her granddaughter from the inside out. She watched Omakayas for a long time, then shook her head. No, not yet. When a mother puts charcoal on her child's face, it was a sign that the child was ready to starve for a vision, for power. A child with a blackened face didn't eat for days, and sometimes lived out in the woods alone, until the spirits took pity on him or her and helped out with a special vision, a special visit, some information. But Omakayas was too young, according to Grandma, so Mama stirred the fire and worried. She had a lot to think about anyway, including a name for baby Nemo, who was getting restless, trying to crawl out of the cradle board, acting as though he were anxious to have that name. There were 7 or 8 people on the island who possessed the right to give names. Auntie Muskrat was one, Day Thunder, Swan, Old Man Migwans, and an ancient lady named Wawanakaway knew how to dream names. Mama had asked, and each of them had tried, but not one of them had yet dreamed about a name for Nemo. For some reason, said Auntie Muskrat, that dream won't come. She even slept and fasted in the woods for a name. But the spirits were stubborn. Old Wamakaway, who had dreamed many names, had no name for the baby either. But she said that she would give no other name until she found one for the boy. She searched her dreams. Meantime, baby Nemo grew. Omakayas decided in secret that the naming was up to her. In play, when just the 2 of them were together, she gave her little brother names, bird names. Chickadee, she called him, a bitchy, robin, little junco, sparrow, grouse chick. He seemed to like all of his bird names, and when he heard them he grinned and waved his chubby arms in delight. Omakayas could hardly resist Nemo, and played with him as often as she was allowed. There was something about the way he looked at her so sadly with big, soft eyes that made her want to cuddle him tight in her arms. There was something about the way he smiled when she made a face, surprised, so grateful, that made her kiss and touch his hair with great passion and indignation in her heart. He should have a name, and clearly he wanted out of his ticknoggin. Omakayus wanted to help him to freedom. Her chance came. One morning later on in the summer, Omakayus's mother, sister, grandma, and little Pinch all wanted to go into the village and see the big canoes that had arrived to unload furs at the traders. Omakayus's father, Miquam, wasn't with these voyagers, but Mama hoped that they might have news of him. The thought itself made Mama so anxious that she got ready to go off in haste, though baby Niwo was still sleeping. "Why don't you leave Niwo with me?" Omakayus asked at the last moment. "I don't want to go. I can take care of him, and you'll get there faster." She saw Mama's thoughts falter. "You don't want to go?" "I don't." Angeline and Grandma were already halfway down the path. Little Pinch was tugging on Mama's legging, whining for something to eat. "All right," Mama decided. "We'll be right back. Now don't do anything. Just rock him, Omakayus, and play with him if he wakes up. Don't do anything." "Of course not," said Omakayus, trying hard not to show how excited she was to have her baby brother, Niwo, all to herself. She made herself tall and acted as grown-up as possible. Rocked him with one hand, gently, while she waved goodbye to Mama, and kept rocking long after her mother rounded the corner and disappeared into the ferny forest growth. He didn't wake. She quit rocking and just stared at his slumbering face. His lashes were so long and stiff, his little chin so chubby, she wanted to stroke it. The skin on his cheeks so fine and delicate and soft, she could hardly keep from brushing her lips across them. Tufts of silken hair stood out all over his head, and his breath was still sweet with milk. She touched him very gently. "Baby Niwo. Chickadee." The name popped into her mind. "Today I'll call you Chickadee," she said. His eyes opened, as though he understood. His look was bright and filled with secret jokes. He gazed up into her face. For a long time they looked at one another. It was perfect. It was love. And then his little face crumpled. One fat tear squeezed from his eye. His lower lip shook. Suddenly his mouth flew open, and he bawled. Omakayus was so close, so dreamy and happy, that the force of it nearly flipped her back, head over heels. His squall was like a whirlwind, like a sudden wash of freezing spray, like a harsh wind, weathered like a hot wall of sound. "Shh, shh, shush." Omakayus rocked and muttered, shushed, hummed, and sang an old lullaby her mother used. Nothing worked. Baby Niwo screamed louder, with increasing force. Omakayus was alarmed. She'd never heard him scream like this. Had she? What was wrong? Was something, a biting fly, spider, tick, bee, something stinging or biting him inside the tight binding of his ticknoggin? Only one way to find out. Unbind him. And that was forbidden. Still, as Niwo's miserable and now hysterical sobbing continued, and got even stronger, she decided to make a grown-up decision and take Niwo from his cradleboard. And so she did. She undid the twist of vine that held him inside the beaded velvet wrapping. She carefully untied and spread the embroidered wrapping, and then took out his diaper moss and brushed him off like a root pulled from the ground. He was naked, of course, but it was a warm day, and so she lifted him immediately into her arms, still weeping, and brought him to a sunny place just beyond the house, behind the trees, out near the water. Omakayus suddenly realized that Niwo had quieted. Her ears were still ringing with the sounds of his cries. Seagulls wailed. A skinny shorebird ran up and down the sand, busily pecking. Niwo brandished his chubby fists, slithered at the water, blasted spit excitedly at the sparkling waves, and turned his melting and mischief-filled eyes upon his sister to tell her she was the most wonderful human on earth. She settled him beside her on a warm stretch of rock, put a stick in his hand. He looked at the stick, tested it between his gums. He had one pitiful little tooth he was very proud of, and he tried to use it to bite the stick. The stick was too strong for Nemo. He banged it purposely at the little circles of green lichen scattered on the stone surface. When the stick broke in two, he yelled in sheer joy and continued beating the rock with the short end of it. Omakheus was so happy that she laughed out loud. "You'll be a drummer, a singer. I'll dance for you," she said. Although it was wrong of her to have set Nemo free, it was very obvious that he had always wanted to be banging a stick on a rock and feeling the warm sun on his face. They sat together for a good while longer. Omakheus tossed stones into the water, sending up splashes to surprise her little brother, and he in turn seemed to try and talk to her in serious burps and babbles about what it was like to be a baby packed into a carrier, hanging on a branch all day long, never allowed to throw rocks or stuff leaves into his mouth. Omakheus thought she heard him tell her this was the best day of his life so far. She thought she heard him tell her that she was his very favorite sister, and he liked her much, much better than Angeline. He definitely said to her that he would never forget this, and that when they were very old, he would stare at her the way he was doing now, and laugh, and they'd both be toothless then. "But I'll have to put you back now, or else I'll get in trouble," Omakheus said. Regretfully, she lifted him into her arms, a delicious baby weight, and carried him jouncing back to the clearing and the house. As she laid him back into his wrappings and began to lace him in, his face crumpled in betrayal, and he opened his mouth. Quickly Omakheus reached into her pocket. The remains of the treat from old Tallow was still there. She popped the last little bit of the lump of maple sugar onto his tongue. His mouth closed. A look of blissful surprise came over his face. His body relaxed. By the time Omakheus had him laced back into the tickanoggin, his eyelids were drooping. And by the time her mother came home, with no news of her father, but with a bit of brilliant red cloth, 4 brass buttons, and 6 thimbles for which she traded a load of dried fish, Omakheus was rocking Nemo as though she'd been doing so all along, and her little brother was smiling in his sleep.